We're all familiar with the villains of Thomas and Friends. Diesel, Spencer, Ace, Vinny, that one piece of granite. Their crimes are pretty easy to prove. Kidnapping, attempted murder, they commit it on screen. It's not subtle. Amateur hour as far as critical thinking and media studies go. You could also argue, as some have, that the Fat Controller is a villain in his own right. I don't necessarily agree, but it does take a little more neurological effort to at least try to prove. Even characters we're meant to feel fondly towards will get their moment in the villain spotlight. James, Gordon, and Henry being perfect examples. They do get their pitiful moments, usually outcomes of their own stupidity. But between their ageism, classism, and generally rancid vibes, it's obvious when they're in the wrong. But there's another villain at work here, and he's been under our buffers this whole time, subtly spreading his insidious influence in the background. One you wouldn't expect, and is even depicted as the ultimate victim half the time, duping everyone in the series and, one could argue, the writers themselves. And that character, dear listener, is none other than Edward. But wait, I hear you Edward loyalists cry. How can this be? Dear sweet old Edward, the very first of Audrey's characters, the beloved engine whose stories he soothed his germ-ridden spawn to sleep with. Perhaps his villainy was not thought of in his conception, but it nonetheless developed and festered like mold on a perfectly good apple Danish. Let's dive in. One of the earliest hints of Edward's crimes, though not the earliest, we'll get to that later, is in Thomas the Tank Engine, the second Railway series book and the first to have Thomas. It was eventually adapted into The Adventure Begins, the ultimate Thomas media of all time.
He's the really useful engine we adore.
Anyway, Thomas spends a lot of time around Edward, learning the ropes, but mostly complaining about wanting to see the world. Eventually, all this bitching gets too much for Edward, and in Thomas and the Trucks, he lets him take his trucks, knowing pretty damn well that Thomas doesn't know how to handle trucks and is likely going to end up injured or dead. But what are you gonna do? Even if we do take it that he had good intentions, it's a bit like letting your 7-year-old drive for the day, just so they can see what it's like. It's deliberate child endangerment. There's no way Edward is naive enough to not realize the potential consequences. Don't believe me? Look at this. Look at that face. Just after the Fat Controller walks away, is that remorse? No, that is an engine who's annoyed he got caught in his negligence. See how quickly his expression changes? Edward can turn it on and off like a light switch. This brief yet revealing clip is only a glimpse at the layers of Edward's deception and manipulative nature, and is one of the many reasons why Andrew Brenner should have an Oscar. Trouble in the Shed is another iconic early Railway series story. It's part of Troublesome Engines, the book that brought us Percy, and for that, we can forgive it for most things. But it's also a blatant piece of anti-union propaganda. The plot is roughly this. Gordon, Henry, and James have to do their own shunting, because Thomas is busy on his own branch line. The big engines, knowing this is not part of their job description, and indeed may be dangerous for engines of their class, go on strike. The Fat Controller, after unsuccessfully attempting to break the strike, eventually acquiesces to the engine's demands and purchases a new tank engine, Percy, to take over Thomas's old work. Collective action works, right? Wrong! Even though the big engine striked for better conditions and actually got their demands met, they're somehow still presented as the haters and losers and soy jacks of the story. Wilbur pulls off this psyop via skillful deployment of one character in particular, Edward the Union Buster. Poor, pathetic Edward, still so recently granted his day out but not yet alpha enough for his own branch line, is once again the bullying victim. Look at the poor little guy, look at his feet. The other engines are hissing at him and calling him Black Wheels. Oh, it's so nasty, right? You can't just help but pity him. Well, until you realize that Black Wheel is likely a reference to black leg, a term likely originating from miners who cross a picket line to work while their colleagues striked. Until you realize Edward has been too cowardly to show any kind of solidarity with his working brethren. By continuing to work despite the call to action, he lessens the impact of the strike and is personally responsible for setting the labor movement back about a century. And the whole time he makes us feel sorry for him when actually he's nothing more than a class traitor. Margaret Thatcher wishes. Now let's talk about Old Iron. Wait, we're already talking about Edward. No. I mean the story Old Iron from the book Edward the Blue Engine, or as it should have been named, Edward the worst engine of all time and true villain of this series, may his name ever be feared. Or something to that effect. Honestly, every story in the book displays his problematic behavior. There's no way he didn't know Birdie was trying to catch up. But Old Iron is the final story in Edward's big moment. James becomes a runaway train, and Edward and the Inspector, Indiana Jones, save him from an untimely end. Now, James is his own brand of awful. And on reflection, Thomas probably should have just left him to die in that field. But in this story, he's clearly in the right. For once! Here's the start of the story, word for word. One day, James had to wait at Edward's station till Edward and his train came in. This made him cross. "Late again," he shouted. Edward only laughed, and James fumed away. Edward only laughed. Edward only laughed! He holds up James and all of his passengers and probably disrupts the whole timetable. He doesn't even offer the slightest apology. He laughs! And, late again? This is a repeat offense! This is the absolute start of the story, so you can't even say James has done anything to deserve this treatment. Edward just woke up, and as he so often does, chose violence. The worst part of it all is when James tries to complain to Thomas and Percy, they jump to Edward's defense. They even gaslight James on Edward's behalf, telling him that Edward's not slow and in fact could beat James in a race. This is the difference between Edward and James. James is nasty, but he never tries to hide it. Edward, on the other hand, presents a sweet old man facade that has people rushing to defend him even if he's clearly in the wrong. He doesn't have the courage to insult James himself, but he's happy for the kids to do his dirty work. The story ends with James becoming a runaway. Not his fault either, by the way. His driver selfishly dies on the job, and then a couple of boys mess with his controls. A traumatic enough experience without Edward rescuing him in the smuggest way possible. "So the Old Iron caught you after all," says Edward. That sick, twisted son of a bitch. Now let's move to the TV series. Escape, from season 3, was in the Railway series book Enterprising Engines, but its little tidbit of Edward antics was only added in the show. At the start, Edward is having a cheeky little catch-up with his bestie Trevor, whom he rescued from scrap in probably his only truly unselfish act. Douglas goes by, and somewhat annoyed that he's busting his ass while these guys recreate the King of the Hill intro, and asks that Edward stop gossiping in the sun when there's work to be done. Too right, but Edward doesn't take this so well. Later, he has this conversation with Douglas.
"Trevor and I are old friends, and you and he have a lot in common too." "Och, aye," quizzed Douglas. "And what'd that be?" "Scrap," said Edward quietly. Douglas gasped. "Don't mention that word. It makes my wheels wobble." "It does the same to Trevor," replied Edward. "He was being sent to the scrapyard, but the vicar and I saved him."
Remember, Douglas? Remember when you were almost scrapped? Well, Trevor also nearly got scrapped. Isn't that crazy? Scrap! Douglas is clearly triggered and experiencing a trauma response. He begs Edward to stop, but Edward goes on nonetheless, in blatant regards of Douglas's boundaries and lived experiences. Clearly, Edward hates abuse victims and the mentally ill. Now, you might say that this conversation was ultimately a net good. After all, it led to Douglas rescuing Oliver, right? Well, to that I say, Douglas would have done that anyway! He does do it anyway in the Railway series version. He doesn't need Edward to tell him to be a good person. He helps Oliver because, unlike Edward, he has class solidarity and a backbone. King! Season 5, Rusty and the Boulder. This is a small one, but definitely worth mentioning. This is the only appearance of Thumper, whom the wiki calls a pounding implement, which we won't address right now. Edward is briefly at the start of the episode delivering Thumper.
"It's called Thumper.
Now, I know what you're thinking. Thumper just uses neopronouns. Thumper's preferred pronouns are it/its. Wrong again! Other media and merchandise consistently refer to him with he, him. Edward not only misgenders, but totally dehumanizes Thumper, while Thumper's right there! We can only hope that non-binary icon Rusty treated him a little better. Season 10's Edward Strikes Out is already pretty infamous, but in case you don't know it, here's a quick recap. This is Rocky's debut episode. Our friend Edward, with a little help from Gordon, but you'd expect this sort of thing from Gordon, ruins his first day by calling him newfangled nonsense and basically just bitching about Rocky, who hasn't even said 2 words to him, to anyone who will listen. There's clear ableist undertones to this, given that the heart of his objection is that Rocky can't move by himself. One assumes he'd be dissing Cranky for the same reason, if Cranky could hear him up there. Then he spills pipes all over the track like an idiot and eventually has to beg for Rocky, who would have every right to hit Edward with an but instead very kindly helps clear up his mess. The reason this episode is well known is because some people feel Edward was out of character and poorly written. But to that I say, try getting your sweet, lovable grandma onto the topic of trans people, or immigrants, or the green M&M, and see how sweet and lovely she stays. Do you then accuse your grandma of being poorly written? No, because you know this is what old people are like. They can be perfectly nice and make the best cookies, but when they encounter any one of the things Fox News has instructed them to hate, the bile begins. The truth is that, deep down, all old people are crusty bigots, and the nicer they are on the outside, the nastier their beliefs are bound to be. Remember this the next time an old person is nice to you. Especially if it's Edward. Edward in the Mail from season 11 is another masterclass from Edward in generating pity. Percy, whose entire personality at this point in the show was mail, is in the works, so Edward has to deliver the mail train. And he fucks it up. Absolute carnage. Not only does he deliver everything to the wrong people, but in attempting to fix it, he gets lost, ends up on a closed branch line, and spills the parcels everywhere. Doesn't sound like Edward, right? Old, reliable, competent Edward? Sounds more of like a late series Toby thing to do, doesn't it? There's a reason for this. Let's talk about weaponized incompetence. Oh, babe, I'd totally do the dishes, but you're so much better at it. It's where you deliberately do a bad job of a task you dislike, so you're not asked to do it again. Edward in the Mail is weaponized incompetence honed to a fine art. Not only does Edward screw everything up, but he looks so sad and pathetic about it, he couldn't possibly have done it on purpose. How can you be mad at him? It was just a little gross negligence of mail fraud. Salty's surprise from season 16 is another example of boomer behavior. It proves that Edward is the type of bitch to complain about Starbucks cups. Edward is left horrified when he learns that Salty doesn't have any Christmas presents. It is all but stated that Salty does not celebrate Christmas, but Edward does not respect this boundary, and in true Christo-fascist style, thrusts repeated unwanted presents upon Salty, pretending it's out of benevolence. The presents aren't even good.
I've brought you a fancy funnel. It's a pot of bright green paint. Now you can be as green as a Christmas tree.
The worst part is that Edward knows what he's doing. This isn't simple ignorance. He's targeting Salty for his faith. He makes a mockery of inclusion by saying things like, "Happy winter holiday, I brought you a Christmas tree." I'm naughty, I wish I was kidding.
Happy winter holiday, Salty. I've brought you a Christmas tree.
But all of this is conjecture, you say. It could be brushed off as poor writing if you really insist on using that argument, or taken out of context. Fine then. Let's look at the actual, irrefutably worst thing Edward's done. Something he's managed to get away with, and continues to get away with since day one. To talk about the worst thing Edward's ever done, we have to start with the worst thing Andrew Brenner's ever done. Big World, Big Adventures not only shows that Peter Andre still got it, but it also shows us that not all trucks are like that. The trucks Thomas meets in Kenya are positively delightful. They sing Thomas a cute song to make him feel better. And it's not just here. In Brazil, the trucks give Nia backup on a lovely song about friendship. Thomas thanks them for this by nearly killing them. Twice. But they even take that in good spirits. Honestly, side tangent here, but listen. Thomas is kind of a menace to trucks this whole movie. Like, pour one out for this one. Minding his own business, probably abandoned in that mine years ago, then here comes Big Blue Tank Engine Thomas, and boom. By the way, we don't see this wayward truck being put back on the rails with the others, so we can only assume that he was left to die of exposure. Clearly, Thomas has learned a lot from Edward. Speaking of Edward, how does this all relate back to him? Well, up to this point, trucks in this franchise series have always been troublesome. Yet, Bwubba reveals this is not a trait trucks are born with. They do not have original sin. It seems to be a particular disease of the Sudric contingent. And what's something every Sudric truck has in common? Exposure to Edward. After all, Edward's been around since the start. If he hasn't had direct contact with the truck, they nonetheless will know and fear him. Google generational trauma. To see the most damning proof of Edward's reign of truck terror, we must jump back from Bwubba to the very first story of the Railway series, Edward and Gordon. When Edward isn't in a depressive episode, he goes out and plays with the trucks. In much the same way a cat might play with a bird, it's in the process of mauling to death. He rams them into sidings with positive glee, getting sick enjoyment from their cries of pain. It doesn't even stop there. Just abusing the trucks himself isn't enough. It can be argued that Edward is responsible for the truck's underclass status. When he mentors Thomas, new to the railway, one of the things he tells them is, trucks can be troublesome. This is called victim blaming. He offloads his work onto Thomas, then sits back and enjoys the carnage when the trucks, like the damaged children they are, inevitably act out. Thomas is then left with his own trauma, convinced that trucks are an inherently malevolent species, and treats them accordingly.
The trucks can help you, you know.
Oh, of course they can. Trucks love to be helpful.
Edward positions himself as the authority on trucks, and soon every other engine is following his example. It becomes a vicious cycle, wherein the trucks, knowing nothing but pain, lash out in the only ways they can manage. The engines, suffering the consequences, treat the trucks more and more harshly. The trail of Edward's truck oppression can be followed from the very start of the Railway series, right to the end of the CGI series. The only reason this doesn't continue and all engines go is because Mattel decided to take Edward and Henry out back and put them down like a pair of lame horses. I'm pretty sure anyway, I'm not watching All Engines Go. It might be argued that the troublesome trucks are the most consistent antagonists of the series, causing endless accidents and turmoil. Thomas in the breakdown train, brake van, pop goes the diesel. All examples of the ramifications brought about by Edward's abusive behavior. One Sodor engine is a notable exception to the trauma cycle. Hero. It says something that the only apparent way to escape Edward's malign influence is to be lost in a forest for a few decades. Picture unrelated. Hero treats trucks with compassionate authority, like a highly competent social worker to troubled kids, and who'da thought? This results in better behavior from his trucks. In No More Mr. Nice Engine, Edward witnesses Diesel giving some trucks a hard time. Tragically learned behavior, which is ultimately a result of his own doing. He has the audacity to tell Diesel off for biffing the trucks, despite his own history. Then, Hero shows up, and some other stuff happens, and Diesel actually has a really sweet moment where he, without prompt, asks Hero what's wrong. Then he kind of undoes the sweetness by hitching himself to the back of Hero's train and causing problems, but that's neither here or there. Eventually, we reach the climax of the story. Diesel gets told off, and Edward, like the dirty, dirty rat he is, snitches on Diesel's earlier truck biffing.
Diesel, was it you? Why you the one biffing and bashing me?
And he spilled your milk this morning, Hero.
I mean, apart from the hypocrisy, there was no need for that. Diesel was already in trouble. Edward just wanted to feel superior, despite all he subjected these trucks to, knowing he is the true reason Diesel is mistreating them now. That's perhaps the worst part of Edward's truck mistreatment, that he can't even own up to his twisted legacy. Looking good in front of Hero and the Fat Controller is more important. Of course, We all crave Hero's approval, but this blatant hypocrisy cannot be forgiven. Honestly, Hero was one of the biggest threats in Edward's scheme, which is probably why he got sent back to Japan, which, let's be honest, you know he was killed on arrival. So, in a way, you could trace nearly every accident involving the trucks back to its putrid source. Edward the Blue Engine. I don't want to hear, Edward's a boring character, he's too nice, ever again. This geriatric machine has been playing 4D chess with us this whole time. Now, the ultimate question is this. Has Edward outconned the Fat Controller? Or have they been in cahoots all these years? I think not. Let's not forget that by Railway Series canon, there have been multiple Fat Controllers, and Edward's outlasted them all. He is 128 years old. He's operating in ancient eldritch mind dimensions no Fat Controller, or indeed any mere mortal, could ever conceive. It's Edward's world. We're just living in it. Shout out to patrons Abigoogle Heaven, Marie M, Sprudel, Sam, Charlotte, Milan Persa, and Fire Cooking. Remember, don't fall for Big Edward.